The gate had not been opened in years. Elliot Marsh could tell by the way the rust had settled into the hinges. Not the fresh orange kind that comes from a season of rain, but the deep brown rust that takes decades to build. Layer by patient layer, like sediment at the bottom of a river. He stood in front of it in the pale light of an October morning, the kind of light that has no warmth in it, just enough brightness to see clearly. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. Behind him, his car, a 2009 Ford with 140,000 miles on it and a heater that worked only when it felt like it, ticked quietly as the engine cooled. He held the demolition notice in his right hand. He had read it 3 times already. 90 days to bring the structure into compliance with municipal safety codes or face mandatory demolition at the owner's expense. The estimated cost of compliance repairs, $412,000. His annual salary as a substitute teacher in the Aldenmore Public School District, $31,000 before taxes. The math was not complicated. Elliot Marsh, 52 years old, folded the notice one more time and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. The jacket was a Carhartt he had owned for 11 years. The lining on the left sleeve had started to separate at the seam, and he had been meaning to get it repaired for 3 winters now. He pressed his hand against the iron gate and pushed. The hinges screamed. Birds lifted from the oak trees that lined the driveway, a whole black cloud of them, rising and wheeling against the pale sky before settling back into the branches further up the hill. Elliot watched them go. Then he looked at what was in front of him. Wren Manor. 3 stories of Victorian architecture built in 1897 by a man named Augustus Wren, who had made his fortune running railroad lines through the mountains of northern New England. The house had once been the grandest private residence in Aldenmore, Vermont. People had driven from 3 counties away just to stand at this gate and look up at it. There had been photographs of it on the front page of the Burlington Free Press, twice. That was a long time ago. Now the turrets at the corners of the 3rd floor were strangled by decades of vine growth, the stems as thick as a man's wrist in some places. 3 windows on the upper floor were boarded over with plywood that had gone gray and soft with weather. The wraparound porch sagged on the left side where the support columns had rotted at their bases. The paint, once a deep colonial blue with white trim, had peeled away in long curling strips, like the bark of a birch tree in late summer, exposing the bare wood underneath, which had gone silver gray from years of sun and frost. Elliot stood at the end of the driveway for a long moment. He was not a man given to sentiment. 24 years of substitute teaching had cured him of most of his illusions. You show up in the morning, you do the work that nobody else wanted to do that day, you go home. The school calls you or it doesn't. The rent gets paid or it doesn't. You make the small choices that keep the small life running, and you try not to think too hard about how it got small in the first place. But standing there in the cold October light, looking up at this ruined and enormous house that had somehow improbably legally become his, Elliot Marsh felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt curious. He walked up the driveway alone. The gravel was overgrown on both sides, the grass having reclaimed most of the path's edges over decades of neglect, but the center held. His footsteps were quiet on the soft ground. The oak trees on either side were old, genuinely old, the kind of old that has nothing to prove, their trunks 3 feet across at the base, their root systems pushing up the earth around them in long, slow waves. Augustus Wren had planted these trees when he built the manor, which meant they had been saplings once, and now they were this, and the man who planted them had been gone for nearly a century. Elliot stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the facade. Even in its ruined state, the house communicated something, a scale of ambition. The turrets at the corners were not merely decorative. They were a statement about what a man believed he had earned and what he intended to leave behind. The wraparound porch, even sagging, spoke of a time when people used porches not as architectural afterthoughts, but as the primary interface between private life and the world outside. The stained glass panels flanking the front door were intact, their colors muted by grime but unbroken. He climbed the steps carefully, testing each one before committing his weight. They held. He took the brass key from his jacket pocket, old and heavy, the bow shaped like a trefoil, a design he had not seen on a key before, the 3 lobes meeting at perfect angles, the surface worn smooth from decades of handling. He had been carrying it since the reading 3 weeks earlier, transferring it from jacket to jacket, unwilling to leave it anywhere. He fitted into the lock. The mechanism turned on the first try. The heavy oak door swung inward without resistance, and Elliot stepped into the foyer of Wren Manor for the first time. He stopped. Even after everything, after the crumbling exterior, after the boarded windows and the sagging porch and the 20 years of neglect visible from the outside, the interior stopped him cold. The foyer rose 20 feet to a plasterwork ceiling decorated with interlocking geometric patterns, vines and angles meeting at a central medallion directly above the chandelier. The chandelier itself was dark, its crystals filmed with dust, but the morning light came through the tall windows on either side of the door and caught the prisms and broke them into small, pale rainbows that moved slowly across the walls as the light shifted. A grand staircase curved upward from the center of the room, its mahogany banister dulled but intact, each baluster carved individually. No two exactly alike, Elliot noticed, if you looked closely enough. The floors were hardwood, wide plank, warped in places but still bearing the grain patterns of trees that had been old when Augustus Wren commissioned them cut. Elliot stood in the middle of the foyer for a long moment and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to. He moved through the ground floor methodically, the way a man moves through a problem he is trying to understand. The formal dining room had a fireplace built from fieldstone, its mantelpiece carved with a pattern of interlocking leaves. The library's walls were lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelves, most of them empty now, though a few leather-bound volumes remained, scattered across the shelves at odd intervals like teeth in an old jaw. The kitchen had been renovated at some point in the 1950s. The appliances were mid-century, useless now, but the bones of the original kitchen were visible beneath, the wide stone hearth behind the modern range, the hand-hewn beams overhead. In the formal parlor, leaning against the baseboard, he found an old portrait photograph. He picked it up carefully. The image was sepia tone, mounted on thick cardboard, the edges worn soft with age. A man in his mid-40s wearing a dark suit stood at the center. His posture was straight, his expression composed, but there was something in his eyes, a quality of attention, of watchfulness, that made him look like a man accustomed to seeing things before they happened. Beside him stood a woman in a high-collared dress. 2 children sat in chairs in front of them, a boy and a girl, posed formally. Behind them all, barely visible at the edge of the image, were the front columns of Wren Manor. Elliot turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, Augustus and Catherine Wren, with Thomas and Eleanor. October 1901. He studied the man's face for a long moment. The set of the jaw, the quality of stillness in the expression, not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man who had learned to contain a great deal of motion inside a composed exterior. There was something about the eyes, even in the sepia flatness of the image, that communicated intelligence of a particular kind, the kind that does not announce itself. Elliot propped the portrait against the parlor wall and looked at it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went to find the source of the water stain spreading across the kitchen ceiling. The pipe under the pantry sink had been failing for years. Elliot could tell by the calcium deposits built up around the joint. That kind of buildup takes a long time. There was standing water on the pantry floor, and the subfloor beneath the linoleum had gone soft. Not dangerous yet, but heading there. If it was left through the winter, the freeze-thaw cycle would finish what the slow leak had started. He did not call a plumber. He drove to the hardware store in town, bought the fittings he needed with $63 from his checking account, came back, got down on the floor under the sink, and started working. He had learned basic plumbing the same way he had learned most practical things, from necessity, over time, with no particular grace but a reliable stubbornness. The work was awkward in the confined space. His knees ached against the hard floor. He was 52 years old and the floor did not care. He was under there for 40 minutes. At some point, working the old fitting loose with both hands, he braced his boot against the pantry wall for leverage. The wall shifted slightly. Not structurally, just the lath and plaster giving under pressure, the way old walls do when the material has dried out and the adhesion between layers has weakened. He felt it move, and then something else happened. A long strip of wallpaper along the baseboard peeled back with a sound like a slow exhale. Elliot stopped working. He sat up, not easy under a sink at 52, with knees that had opinions about sudden movements, and looked at what had come loose. The wallpaper beneath the sink was already damaged, blistered from years of slow moisture, working up through the floor and into the wall. The strip that had peeled back was about 8 inches wide and 2 feet long, and what was revealed beneath it was not the plain wood he expected. Something had been carved into the wall. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam caught the surface and the shadows in the grooves jumped sharp and clear. Not scratches, not damage. Deliberate carving, clean, precise lines made by a skilled hand with proper tools. Geometric symbols, intersecting circles, angular patterns that repeated and varied in a way that suggested logic, intention, system. He traced one line with his fingertip, smooth at the surface, the edges of the groove worn rounded by a century of temperature change and settling, but the form itself intact. Exact. Elliot reached out and touched the surface with his fingertips. The wood was smooth from age, the carved lines worn at their edges by a century of settling and temperature change, but the image was intact. He moved the flashlight slowly across the wall. The carving extended further than the exposed strip, much further. He stood up. He found the edge of the wallpaper and pulled. The paper was old enough and damp enough that it came away easily, in long strips that curled as they fell. He worked steadily, pulling strip after strip, moving across the wall from left to right, revealing what was beneath. The plaster beneath the paper came with it in places, crumbling at the seams, but the wood behind it held, and on the wood, carved into the structural planking of the wall itself, not merely scratched on the surface, was the design. He stepped back and looked. The wall was covered completely, every inch of it. The carvings formed a dense, intricate composition. Geometric patterns and concentric rings, astronomical symbols he half recognized from some long-ago course in college, mathematical notations arranged in sequences that suggested equations, and woven through all of it, lines and arrows and connective marks that implied the whole thing was not many separate images, but one single integrated design. Not random, not decorative in the conventional sense, something more purposeful than both. At the center of the wall, in a clear space left intentionally free of surrounding detail, the eye of the composition, the point toward which all the surrounding elements oriented, a single word had been carved in elegant cursive script. The letters were larger than the surrounding notations, cut deeper into the wood, as if the carver had wanted this particular word to be the last thing that could be lost to time. Begin. Elliot stood in the cold pantry for a long time. The flashlight on his phone began to dim as the battery drained, and he did not notice until the screen went dark. He stood in the near dark with the carved wall in front of him and the broken pipe dripping slowly behind him. A small, patient sound in the silence. He was not scared. He was not excited, exactly. He was awake, fully, completely awake, in a way he had not been in longer than he could remember. The particular quality of alertness that comes when something presents itself that is genuinely worth paying attention to. Not urgent, not alarming, but real. Undeniably, unmistakably real. He took out his phone, plugged it into the charger he had left on the kitchen counter, and waited 3 minutes. Then he came back and photographed every inch of the wall methodically, overlapping the frames so that nothing was missed. He took 47 photographs. He checked each one on the screen to make sure the resolution was sufficient, that the carved lines were visible in the image the way they were visible to the eye. Then he went back under the sink and finished fixing the pipe. 3 weeks earlier, a lawyer named Gideon Pratt had read the last will and testament of Harold Marsh, Elliot's great uncle on his father's side, a man Elliot had met exactly 4 times in his life, in a conference room on the 3rd floor of an office building in Burlington. The room smelled of old carpet and recycled air. There were 11 people present. Elliot had driven 2 hours to be there. His sister Claudia had arrived first. She always arrived first. Claudia was 3 years younger than Elliot, sold commercial real estate in Burlington, and wore the kind of confidence that comes from having been right about enough things over the years that she had stopped questioning her own judgment. She had taken a photograph of the will documents before the lawyer finished distributing them, which was the kind of thing Claudia did. Not out of bad faith, but out of habit. The habit of someone who understood that information was the first asset and acquisition of it should not wait on courtesy. His brother Warren had sat across the table. Warren was 50 years old, ran the Northeastern division of an insurance company, headquartered in Hartford, and had the manner of a man who had spent so long calculating risk that he had forgotten how to be surprised by anything. He had opened his laptop on the conference table and was already looking at something on the screen while Gideon Pratt cleared his throat to begin reading. Not rudely, Warren was never rude, just efficiently. The way a man is when he has learned that most meetings contain less information than advertised, and the preparation for the next thing should not wait on the conclusion of the current one. Their father, Bernard Marsh, had sat at the far end of the table, 78 years old, retired. He had a full head of white hair and the upright posture of a man who had once served in the army and never entirely stopped. He did not look at Elliot. He looked straight ahead toward the window, where the tops of the maple trees were showing their October colors through the glass. The trees were at their peak, the particular brilliant red of a sugar maple in the second week of October, the color that people drive hours through Vermont to see. Bernard looked at them with an expression that contained nothing Elliot could read. Sylvia had been there too, Elliot's ex-wife. They had been divorced for 6 years, but she had been close to Harold in the way that Elliot had never managed to be, and Harold had apparently asked her to attend the reading. She sat 2 seats away from Elliot and looked at her hands folded on the table in front of her. She had lost weight since the last time he had seen her, and she looked well. He was glad she looked well. Her parents had been there as well. Her mother in particular had chosen a seat near the center of the room where she could be heard by everyone without raising her voice. This was a skill she had developed over the years to a fine degree. When Gideon Pratt got to the part about Wren Manor, 17 rooms, 3 floors, 3 acres of land in Aldenmore, Vermont, with an estimated property value pending current assessment, Claudia's fingernails stopped clicking against the edge of her phone. Warren looked up from his laptop screen. Bernard continued looking at the maple trees, and Sylvia's mother said, at a volume calibrated precisely for the entire room, "Well, I suppose every family has its dreamer." There was a sound, not quite laughter, more like the socially acceptable exhale that means the same thing. The sound of people who found something amusing, but were too well-mannered to say so directly, releasing the amusement in the only way that deniability permitted. Elliot did not respond. He had learned across the long years of his marriage and its unraveling that there was no response worth giving to a remark like that. He had learned it the hard way, through years of attempting responses that either escalated the situation or confirmed the premise. The silence was always better. The silence communicated nothing they could use. He waited for Gideon Pratt to finish reading. He accepted the brass key from the lawyer's hand, old and heavy, with a bow shaped like a trefoil, and he shook Pratt's hand and thanked him, and he left the conference room before anyone else had gathered their things. He drove back to Aldenmore alone in the dark, with the key on the passenger seat beside him. The 2-hour drive through the Vermont mountains in October darkness, the road winding through gaps in the hills, the occasional lights of a farmhouse or a small town visible briefly before the trees closed back in. He did not listen to the radio. He drove in the quiet and thought about nothing in particular, which was a different thing from not thinking. By the time he reached Aldenmore, he had made his decision. He did not know it yet, not in words, not in the fully articulated way that a decision becomes real when you say it out loud or write it down. But it was there in the way that things are sometimes decided below the level of conscious reasoning, in some older part of the mind that operates on pattern and weight rather than logic and language. Nora and Declan arrived Friday afternoon. Elliot heard the car before he saw it, Sylvia's Subaru, pulling up the driveway with the characteristic sound its exhaust had been making since March, a sound that Declan had once diagnosed with impressive mechanical precision as a failing gasket seal, and that Sylvia had been meaning to get fixed. He came out onto the porch to meet them. Nora was out of the car before it stopped moving. She was 11 years old and small for her age. With dark hair she wore in a practical braid, and her mother's dark eyes, and somewhere in there, something that was entirely her own, a quality of attention that made her seem older than she was. She had a worn canvas backpack over one shoulder and a sketchbook tucked under her arm. the sketchbook already showing the signs of heavy use along its spine, the pages swelling slightly from pressure. She was looking at the manor with an expression that contained no fear at all, only fascination. She had her sketchbook open before she reached the porch steps. Her pen moved across the page quickly, the kind of quick that comes from having drawn enough to be able to capture proportion and line without laboring over it. She was drawing the manor silhouette, not a careful architectural rendering, but something more instinctive, the impression of the building as it presented itself. Large, complicated, decayed in specific ways that the drawing caught with a 12-year-old's unself-conscious accuracy. Both the grandeur and the deterioration, neither minimized. Declan got out of the car more slowly. He was 16, already nearly as tall as Elliot, with his father's build and his mother's economy of expression. He looked up at the house the way a contractor looks at a renovation estimate, taking in the scope of the problem, running the numbers, arriving at a figure he was not sure he wanted to share. He said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved from the sagging porch to the boarded windows to the vines at the turrets and back down. Then, how many rooms? 17, Elliot said, not counting the basement. Declan nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Sylvia did not get out of the car. She rolled down the window and looked at Elliot with an expression that carried the weight of 6 years of post-marriage communication. Careful, contained, meaning more than it showed. The expression of someone who has learned to measure their words because the wrong ones have cost too much in the past. She said, I'll pick them up Sunday evening. Then she added quietly, be careful with them, Elliot. He said, I always am. She nodded once and drove back down the driveway. He watched the Subaru until it turned out of sight at the gate, then turned to his children. Elliot took them inside. He led them through the foyer, let them take in the staircase and the ceiling and the dusty rainbows thrown by the chandelier crystals. He let Nora's pen move across the sketchbook page without interrupting her. She was drawing the medallion on the plasterwork ceiling, rotating the sketchbook to get the angle right, her tongue pressed to her upper lip in the expression of concentration she had had since she was 4 years old. He let Declan move through the rooms asking practical questions. What was the electrical system? When had the roof last been inspected? What did municipal compliance actually require in terms of structural assessment? These were the right questions. Elliot answered them honestly, including the ones where the honest answer was that he did not know yet. They spent an hour on the ground floor. Nora filled 6 pages of the sketchbook. Declan filled 3 pages of the small notebook he carried in the compressed handwriting he used when he was moving quickly. Then Elliot took them to the pantry. He did not explain in advance. He simply opened the door and held up the lantern he had bought at the hardware store and let them look. Nora was quiet for 4 full seconds, which was, for Nora, a significant silence. She stood in the pantry doorway and looked at the carved wall in the lantern light, the shadows in the grooves moving slightly as the lantern swayed, giving the composition a quality of motion it did not have in still light. Then she said, in a voice that was almost a whisper, someone was trying to say something, Dad. Well, Declan stepped closer, his eyes moving systematically across the carved surface the way they moved across a math problem, left to right, top to bottom, looking for structure before looking for meaning. Or hide something. Elliot looked at both of them. Maybe both. He had said those words the day before, alone in the dark of the pantry, to no one. Saying them now to his children made them feel more real, not more certain, just more real. The difference between a thought held privately and a thought spoken in the presence of people who are listening. On Monday morning, before his first assignment of the week, a 7th grade science class on the other side of town, Elliot drove to the Aldenmore Public Library. It was a small building, the way most things in Aldenmore were small. 2 main rooms and a storage annex connected to the back, the whole structure dating from the 1920s, built in the same period as many of the civic institutions in small New England towns that had wanted to demonstrate their seriousness during the years of prosperity before everything changed. The building had aged well. The brick was clean, the windows were maintained, the small garden along the front walk had been planted with the kind of perennials that come back reliably without demanding attention. Mrs. Harriet Doyle had been the head librarian for 35 years. She was 68, wore her gray hair in a practical knot, and had the manner of someone who had answered a very large number of questions over the years and had developed both efficiency and genuine interest in the answering. She knew the town's history the way a doctor knows an old patient, not just the facts, but the patterns, the connections, the things that seemed unrelated until they weren't. Elliot told her specifically what he needed. Every document in the local collection related to Augustus Wren and the Wren family. Newspaper records, town archives, business filings, anything that had been donated by families or local historical groups over the years. Mrs. Doyle did not ask him why. She simply went and found what he had asked for, moving through the storage annex with the efficiency of someone who has organized a space and can navigate it without thinking. She came back with 2 cardboard boxes, a leather-bound town record from 1897 through 1932, and a manila envelope of loose photographs. Elliot sat at the reading table and went through everything. Most of it was routine: deed records, business filings for the Wren Railroad Holdings, society pages from the local newspaper featuring the Wrens at various civic functions in the early part of the century. Augustus Wren had been a significant presence in Aldenmore for 3 decades. His name appeared on the cornerstone of the public library, the very building Elliot was sitting in, the founding charter of the hospital, the donation records of the Congregational Church. A man who had understood that a fortune's relationship to a community was not purely extractive. And then Elliot found the newspaper from November 1929. The headline ran above the fold on page 1, in the large type reserved for stories that warranted it: Aldenmore's Wren family vanishes. Railroad baron gone without a word. He read the article 3 times. The Wren family, Augustus, his wife Catherine, and their 2 adult children, had departed Aldenmore sometime in the last days of October 1929. No notice given to neighbors. No farewell to the staff, who arrived for work on a Monday morning to find the house empty and cold, the fires unlit, the breakfast things still on the kitchen shelves where they had been the previous Friday, bills left unpaid at the general store, the pharmacy, the coal yard, the household furniture still in place, 3 automobiles still in the carriage house. The stock market had collapsed on October 29th, Black Tuesday. The Wren family had disappeared 3 days before. Elliot sat with this for a long time. The reading room was quiet around him. A woman at the other table was working through what appeared to be a genealogy project, surrounded by printouts and a laptop. The afternoon light came through the high windows and fell across the reading table in long rectangles. A man who had seen it coming, a man who had looked at the numbers and the patterns, the same way Augustus Wren was said to have looked at all things, and had understood weeks or months before the rest of the world what was about to happen. Not guessed, not feared, understood, with the confidence of someone who had done the calculation and was certain of the result and had prepared. He paid for photocopies of everything relevant. The total was $7.40. He paid from his wallet, the wallet that held $43 and his library card, and a photograph of Nora and Declan from 2 summers ago, standing on a dock somewhere, squinting into the sun. He drove back to the manor with the copies on the passenger seat, the same seat where the brass key had ridden 3 weeks earlier. He spread everything on the kitchen table that evening and worked through it again, more slowly, making notes in the margins of his copies in the handwriting that 24 years of classroom use had made simultaneously clear and fast. He did not call Claudia. He did not call Warren. He did not call his father. He was not ready for any of those conversations yet. He needed to know more before he could hold those conversations and remain steady through them. The calls would come. They always did. And when they came, he needed to be standing on ground he understood. The calls came to him. Claudia, Tuesday morning. She had spoken to a demolition company in Burlington that was willing to work within a tight budget if they could use the salvaged materials from the house. She had their number whenever he was ready. Her voice carried the particular quality it always had when she was being helpful, in a way that also happened to align with what she believed the correct answer already was. Not manipulation. Claudia did not manipulate. She simply could not fully separate her helpfulness from her certainty, and the certainty had arrived before the help was requested. Warren, Tuesday evening, an email this time, 3 paragraphs with a spreadsheet attached. The assessed land value, the estimated cost of bringing the structure into code compliance, the likely sale price if the land were cleared and sold to a developer. Warren had been thorough. He always was. The math was correct. Elliot checked it against his own numbers. The email ended. "I'm not trying to pressure you, Elliot. I just want you to have the facts." Which was true. Warren believed in facts the way other people believe in things that are harder to verify. Sylvia's text came Thursday. "The kids said they're getting attached to that place. I just think you should be realistic, for their sake as much as yours." His father did not call. Bernard Marsh had not called Elliot in 4 months, which was not unusual. Their relationship existed in the space between calls, in the long silences that had accumulated over decades and hardened, like the rust on the gate hinges, into something structural. Not hostile, just settled in the way that certain failures of communication settle over time into a kind of permanent topology, a landscape you navigate around rather than through. Elliot responded to each of them briefly. To Claudia, "Thank you, we're not demolishing." To Warren, "I've seen the numbers, we're not selling." To Sylvia, "I'll be realistic when I've run out of other options." He put his phone face down on the kitchen table and went back to the photographs of the carved wall. He was at the manor on a Saturday afternoon, working on the porch supports, which needed immediate attention before the first frost came and the freeze-thaw cycle began working on the already compromised wood, when the black SUV came up the driveway. The vehicle was a late-model Escalade, clean despite the gravel driveway, with Massachusetts plates. It parked at the edge of the driveway with the precision of someone accustomed to parking in spaces that demanded judgment. The man who stepped out was in his mid-50s, wearing a gray wool suit that had been tailored to fit him specifically. Not the off-the-rack tailoring that passes for custom in most men's wardrobes, but actual bespoke work, the kind that is visible in the way the shoulders sit and the jacket moves when the wearer walks. Silver hair, cut close. He moved across the uneven gravel of the driveway with the unconscious ease of someone who had learned at some point in his life that confidence was the most important thing a man could project in any room, and had spent enough years practicing it that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. He extended his hand before he was close enough for a comfortable handshake, which forced Elliot to either take a step forward or make the man close the distance alone. Elliot stayed where he was. The man closed the distance. He introduced himself as Fletcher Wren, attorney and real estate developer, Boston. He said the name Wren the way a man says a word he has been carrying for a long time. Not heavily, Fletcher Wren was too practiced for that, but with a particular quality of ownership that went beyond the ordinary use of one's own name. He offered $250,000 for the property. Cash. No inspection contingency. Closing within 10 days. He presented this not as an opening position, but as a settled figure. The way you present something when you want the other person to understand that the number has been arrived at through serious consideration and is not a starting point for negotiation. Elliot said no. Fletcher increased to $300,000. Elliot said no again, and something in his voice must have communicated that no further number would change the answer, because Fletcher shifted strategy without visible frustration, the shift of a man who had anticipated resistance and prepared for it. He began to talk about the property, its condition, its complications, the difficulty of navigating the municipal compliance process with a structure of this age and complexity. He spoke knowledgeably, which Elliot noticed. He described the challenges of the electrical system, the plumbing, the structural issues that would require engineering assessment before any renovation could begin. He described the legal complexity of the demolition notice and the appeals process. As he talked, describing the challenges Elliot would face, Fletcher mentioned the height of the foyer ceiling, mentioned the position of the staircase relative to the front entrance, mentioned the layout of the library in relation to the parlor on the opposite side of the hall. He mentioned the pantry, not by name, just as a reference point, describing the western side of the kitchen wing. But what he said about it was specific. The way he described the ceiling height in relation to the window placement, the way he referenced the proportions of the space in relation to the kitchen proper, the way he knew, without being told, without it being in any document that Elliot had seen, that the pantry ceiling was lower than the kitchen ceiling by approximately 18 inches due to the structural beam that ran between them. That was not in the property survey. It was not in any public record. Fletcher Wren had been inside this house. Elliot shook his hand, thanked him for coming, and told him the property was not for sale. His voice was even. He walked back to the porch and picked up his hammer. Fletcher Wren stood in the driveway for a moment that was slightly too long to be casual, slightly too short to be confrontational, then walked back to the Escalade and drove away, the gravel quiet under the tires. Declan was sitting on the porch steps, his notebook in his lap. He had been there the whole time, and he had been quiet, which meant he had been listening. "He knows this house," Elliot said, not turning around. He drove the nail he had been positioning before the interruption. Declan said, "How do you know?" He described the ceiling height differential between the pantry and the kitchen. "That detail is not in any document." A pause. Declan wrote something in his notebook. Then, "So he's been inside?" "Yes. And he wants it badly enough to come here in person and offer cash with no contingencies." "Yes. But he doesn't already own it." Elliot set the hammer down on the porch rail and looked at the gate at the end of the driveway, the iron post standing in the October afternoon light. "No," he said, "he doesn't. And that's the question." That evening after dinner, after Nora had fallen asleep in the second-floor bedroom, they had cleaned out together and Declan was reading in the makeshift living space they had arranged in the library. Declan had taken immediately to the library, as though the room recognized something in him. Elliot sat alone in the kitchen with the photographs of the carved wall spread across the table around him. He had printed them at the pharmacy in town, the 47 photographs, and arranged them on the table so that together they formed a complete image of the wall. Looking at them this way, the whole composition laid out at once, each photograph overlapping slightly with its neighbors, he could see things he had not seen when photographing them individually. The design had a center of gravity. The begin at its center was not merely a starting instruction, it was the nucleus of a radial system, the point from which everything else organized outward. The geometric patterns radiated from it in concentric rings, growing in complexity as they moved away from the center. The astronomical symbols appeared at specific intervals that suggested a relationship to something, a calendar perhaps, or a set of coordinates. The mathematical notations were arranged in a sequence that had the quality of a series, each element building on the previous. This was not the work of an eccentric man decorating a hidden room. This was the work of a precise and systematic mind communicating something with great care. At the center of one photograph, the single word looked back at him from the old wood: begin. He had made his decision 3 weeks ago, the night of the reading, driving home through the dark with the key on the seat beside him. He had not wavered since, though the ground had given him plenty of reasons to. He was not certain he could save the house. He was not certain what saving it would cost him. He was not certain about very much at all. But the man on the wall of that pantry had seen something coming and had built for it anyway. Had carved a message into wood and hidden it behind a wall and trusted that someone, someday, would be stubborn enough or curious enough or desperate enough to find it. Had bet everything on the possibility that the future would contain at least one person worth betting on. Elliot Marsh was all three things: stubborn, curious, and desperate enough, but in the right order, for the right reasons. He gathered the photographs carefully, stacked them in order, and put them in the manila folder he had been using to organize his research. Then he got up, checked the locks on the doors. The Manor's locks were old but functional, and he had tested each of them, and turned off the lantern. Tomorrow he would go back to the library. He had more to find. And somewhere in this house, in its walls and floors, and the careful geometry of its rooms, something was waiting to be found. Something that had been patient for a very long time and would be patient a little longer. The library at Wren Manor smelled of old paper and cold stone. Not the pleasant mustiness of an antique shop or a used bookstore. Something deeper than that, more serious. The smell of documents that had outlasted the hands that made them. The smell of knowledge that had been sealed away and had spent its waiting years becoming more concentrated, the way certain things intensify rather than diminish when they are left undisturbed. Elliot stood in the doorway on a Sunday morning with a lantern in one hand and the manila folder of photographs in the other, and he let his eyes move slowly across the room before he stepped inside. He had learned in the weeks since inheriting this house to look at rooms before entering them. The rooms in Wren Manor rewarded that practice. The built-in shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, cherry wood gone dark with age. the upper sections accessible by a rolling ladder on a brass rail that still moved smoothly when he tested it, better maintained than almost anything else in the house, which suggested that someone had cared for this mechanism specifically, had oiled the wheel bearings and kept the rail clear of debris. Most of the shelves were empty. A few dozen books remained, distributed across the shelves in a pattern that seemed random at first. A cluster of 3 volumes here, a gap of 4 feet, a single volume standing alone, another gap, 2 volumes together. But Elliot had been a substitute teacher for 24 years. He had walked into rooms he had never seen before and tried to understand their logic, what the regular teacher had intended, what system the students had been working within, what the room was trying to tell him about how it was supposed to function. Every classroom had a logic, even the poorly organized ones. The logic was always there if you were willing to look past the surface arrangement to the underlying structure. He stood in the doorway of the library and looked at the books. They were not arranged randomly. They were arranged by color and height, not alphabetically, not by subject, not by the conventional organizing principles of any library he had ever seen or worked in. The spines of the remaining books, red, blue, green, brown, black, varying heights, had been placed with deliberate attention to the visual pattern they created against the empty shelves. Gaps were part of the pattern, spaces were intentional. The empty stretches of shelf were not absences, but presences, structural elements of the design, the way a rest in a piece of music is not silence but duration. Elliot walked to the center of the room and looked at the shelves from a distance, the way you step back from a painting to see what you could not see up close. The distance changed everything. From 8 feet away, the pattern resolved. He saw it in less than a minute. Then he called his daughter. Nora was still in her sleeping bag on the floor of the second-floor bedroom they had cleaned out together the previous weekend. She came downstairs in her socks with her sketchbook already in her hand. She had learned in the past 2 weeks to carry it everywhere in this house, the way you carry a tool when you are working in a place where you never know what you will find next. Elliot stood her in the center of the library and said nothing, just pointed at the shelves. Nora looked for 30 seconds, her head tilted slightly to the right, the small angle of recognition she made when something resolved from confusion into sense. He had been watching her make that gesture since she was 4 years old, working through a puzzle or reading a difficult passage, and it never failed to tell him when she had found the thing she was looking for. It's a composition, she said, like a painting. It has weight and balance. The gaps are part of it. They're as intentional as the books. What does it spell? Elliot asked. She looked longer. Her pen moved across her sketchbook, transcribing the pattern the way a musician transcribes a melody, working from the visual rhythm of the arrangement, translating color and height into a notation system she was inventing as she went. She worked from left to right, shelf by shelf, reading the sequences with the eye of someone who had been trained, without formal instruction, to see how elements relate to one another in a field. It took her 4 minutes, which was 4 minutes of complete silence, except for the pen moving across paper and the occasional sound of the manor settling in the morning cold. Then she looked up at the chamber. Elliot had already suspected it, but hearing the words spoken aloud in this room in his daughter's voice in the cold morning light, something shifted in the atmosphere of the place, the way pressure shifts before weather changes. An internal rearrangement, small but definitive. He moved along the shelves, running his hand across the spines of the remaining books until he found the one that did not feel right. It was positioned on the third shelf from the bottom, in the middle section of the east wall. A dark green volume, unremarkable in appearance, its spine showing the title and author of what appeared to be a treatise on railroad engineering from the 1890s. But when Elliot gripped the spine to pull it out, the weight was wrong. Too light by half. No flex in the pages. No resistance from paper under pressure. He brought it to the reading desk and opened it. It was not a book. It was a box made to look like a book. The spine and cover were real leather binding over real boards, convincing enough that you would have to handle it to know the difference. And most people looking at a shelf did not handle books. The interior was a hollowed wooden case, lined with dark green felt that had faded to gray at the edges, fitted precisely for its contents. Inside the case, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had been folded and sealed at the edges with something that had preserved it almost perfectly against the century of ambient moisture in the room, was a journal. Leather cover, hand-stitched binding, the initials AW embossed in the lower right corner in the simple serif style of the period. Elliot unwrapped it carefully, holding the oilcloth open while Nora steadied the journal and opened to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who had trained himself to be exact, who valued compression and clarity over flourish, who wrote as he apparently did everything else, with the intention of being understood correctly, nothing more and nothing less. The date at the top of the first page, June 14th, 1928. Below the date, a single line. For the worthy finder, may you prove yourself equal to what I have built. Elliot sat down. He read the journal aloud to Nora, choosing the passages that mattered, translating the 19th century formality of Augustus Wren's language into something that moved at the pace of speech. Declan came downstairs 20 minutes in, attracted by the sound of his father's voice in a house that was usually quiet. The low, steady voice Elliot used in classrooms when he wanted students to actually listen rather than just hear, and sat on the floor near the door without interrupting. He had his notebook, and he was writing, but he was listening too. Augustus Wren had begun writing the journal in the summer of 1928. He had been watching the financial markets for 2 years by then, and what he saw in the numbers, the leverage ratios building to levels that had no historical precedent, the speculative excess accelerating rather than moderating, the fundamental disconnection between the paper values being traded and the physical reality of the underlying assets, told him something that the majority of his contemporaries were not willing to hear. The collapse was not a possibility, it was a certainty. The only open question was timing. He had begun making preparations, not the panicked preparations of a frightened man, the systematic preparations of an engineer who understood that the strength of any structure depended entirely on how well it was built before the stress was applied. You did not reinforce a bridge after the flood came. You built the reinforcement in before the flood was visible on the horizon. He had been liquidating certain investments quietly, converting paper assets into instruments that would survive a catastrophic deflation. He had been thinking carefully about what he wanted to preserve, and why, and for whom. Not just his immediate family. Augustus Wren thought on a longer timeline than most. He thought in generations, and he had begun building what he called, in the journal, the preservation system. 3 keys, Augustus had written, hidden in 3 places within the manor, each place chosen for its meaning as much as its concealment. The first in the place that nourishes the body, the second in the place that nourishes the mind, the third in the place that nourishes the soul. Only together do they open what I have sealed. Any 2 alone will fail. This is not a flaw, but a feature. I require the full picture, not the partial one. 3 keys, Declan said from the doorway. He had his notebook open on his knee. Pantry is the body. Library is the mind, Nora said. The master bedroom, Elliot said. The place of rest, the soul. He looked at both of them, his practical 16-year-old son doing the geometry in his head, reducing the metaphor to its spatial implications. His 11-year-old daughter connecting the symbols with the instinct of someone who thought in images and understood intuitively that every image is also an argument. 2 different kinds of mind, both useful, both already ahead of him in the directions they were best equipped to go. We start with the fireplace, he said. The fireplace in the library occupied most of the north wall, a massive construction of fitted field stone, its carved oak mantelpiece running nearly the full width of the wall, a firebox large enough for a man to stand in without ducking. Elliot had looked at it on their first visit and seen only the decorative detail. The carved vines and geometric borders along the mantelpiece face, the keystones carved with compass rose designs, the careful joinery where the mantelpiece met the surrounding stonework. Now he looked at it differently. Declan had crouched down to examine the lower section of the surround, working his flashlight methodically across the carved surface, and he called his father over with the particular tone he used when he had found something that he was not entirely sure how to classify. The carved details on the fireplace surround were not purely decorative, worked into the vines and borders, integrated so skillfully into the organic forms of the design that you could look at them 100 times and see only ornamentation, were symbols, the same family of symbols as the pantry wall, the same geometric vocabulary, the same precision of line, mathematical notations, astronomical references. And there, in the lower left quadrant of the surround, carved into a single stone that had been fitted to the wall separately from the surrounding stones, set at a slightly different angle that was only visible when you were close and looking specifically for discontinuity. A sequence of numbers and operators arranged in the form of an equation. Declan photographed it from 3 angles and sat with his notebook for 12 minutes. "It's a coordinate system," he said finally. Not triumphantly. Declan did not do triumphant, just factually, with the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he was satisfied with the conclusion. "The equation resolves to a specific angular measurement, like a compass of Martin." "A bearing to what?" Elliot asked. Declan looked at his father. "To the location of the second key, somewhere in this room. The bearing assumes you're standing at the center of the fireplace, and it points across the room at a specific angle." He looked up at the room. "There." He indicated the east window and the small side table position near it. Elliot found the second key 20 minutes later, inside the hollow leg of the side table. The leg had been made hollow deliberately, not scooped out clumsily, but turned on a lathe with a blind bore through the center. The cap at the bottom fitted so precisely that it had held its seal for nearly a century. The key fragment was wrapped in the same oilcloth as the journal, folded in the same way. Triangular metal, symbols etched on its face, one edge rough where it had been cut from a larger piece. The first key fragment had been in the pantry. He had found it 3 days after finding the wall carvings, working systematically through the room, pressing on boards and panels until one shifted. It had been behind a loose board in the wainscoting, accessible only if you knew to look. The second was here. He held them side by side, 2 of 3 pieces. The rough edges matched, not identical but complementary, the cuts made to fit together. He looked at the journal entry in his photograph. "The place that nourishes the soul," Augustus had written. The master bedroom. They found the third key fragment in the headboard of the master bed. Nora found it. She had been running her hands along the carved surface of the headboard, tracing the botanical details with her fingertips the way she traced subjects she wanted to draw, feeling the depth and character of the carving as a preliminary to rendering it. And she felt the panel before she saw it, a section of the carving, a section about 4 inches square, centered in a carved rose that had been worked into the headboard's central panel, that moved slightly under pressure. Not loose from damage or age, but hinged deliberately, the mechanism so well made that a century of seasonal expansion and contraction had not compromised the fit by more than a fraction of a millimeter. She pressed in the right place, with the right amount of force, and a small compartment opened. Inside, the third key fragment, wrapped in oilcloth, and beneath it, a folded piece of paper, not the aged browning paper of the journal, but something heavier, with a slight waxy quality to the surface that had helped preserve it almost perfectly against the ambient moisture. Elliot unfolded it carefully, holding it in both hands. It was a partial architectural drawing, a cross-section view of a space he did not immediately recognize. Circular walls, a curved ceiling, specific dimensions annotated in Augustus's handwriting. The level of details was extraordinary. The drawing showed not just the geometry of the space, but the construction methods, the material specifications, the placement of fittings and fixtures. The drawing of a man who wanted whoever found it to understand exactly what had been built. He counted the cross-sections carefully. There was one space labeled clearly at the top of the drawing, antechamber. Below it, connected by a spiral staircase indicated in the margin notation, were 3 additional spaces, each drawn at a different scale, each labeled in the same careful hand. First vault, second vault, master vault, 4 chambers in total. The first was an introduction. The remaining 3 were the substance, the actual repository of what Augustus Wren had spent the last year of his time in Aldenmore constructing and filling. At the bottom of the drawing, in a hand slightly less controlled than the rest, the hand of someone writing quickly, or writing under pressure. A note. "Below the foundation of knowledge lies what I have preserved. The key will show you where to begin. The answer will show you where to end." "The basement," Declan said. "Under the library," Elliot said. "Below the foundation of knowledge." 4 chambers, Nora said, looking at the drawing over his shoulder. He built 4 rooms down there. The 3 key fragments fit together with the precision of something made to be reunited. Elliot assembled them on the kitchen table, the triangular pieces locking along their rough edges, the etched symbols on each face aligning into a continuous pattern when the pieces were joined correctly. The way a broken inscription becomes readable when the fragments are properly arranged. The completed key was palm-sized, heavier than its apparent volume suggested, and when Elliot held it and walked with it, crossing the kitchen, entering the hallway, moving toward the basement door, he became aware of a subtle vibration in the metal. Not mechanical, not electrical, something more fundamental. A directional resonance, stronger in some positions, weaker in others, that provided information without instruction. He had read enough about Augustus Wren's patents in the library archives to have a working theory. The man had held 11 patents in his lifetime. One of them, registered in 1923, which Elliot had found referenced in the Burlington business records, was for a compass-based navigation instrument designed for use in underground mining operations using differential magnetic resonance to identify bearing directions in spaces where conventional compasses were unreliable. Augustus had built a version of that technology into the completed key and into whatever was embedded in the wall behind the chamber entrance, a guidance system that required no map, no explicit instruction, only attention. The basement steps were stone, worn smooth in the center from decades of use, slick with condensation. Elliot went down first with the lantern and the key. Nora and Declan followed, single file, their footsteps quiet on the worn stone. The basement extended far beneath the manor's footprint, room after room of stone-walled space, the air cold and damp and smelling of mineral earth, the floors packed dirt in some sections and flagstone in others. Storage rooms, empty now. A wine cellar, its wooden racks still standing, the bottles long since gone. A mechanical room with the remnants of the original heating system. Massive iron radiators, pipe runs disappearing into the walls, a coal furnace the size of a small car. They searched for 40 minutes. It was the key that found it. Elliot was moving through the room directly beneath the library. He had mapped the manor's footprint carefully enough to know where he was relative to the floors above, when the vibration in the metal changed character. Not stronger exactly, but more focused, the way a sound becomes cleaner and more directional when you move closer to its source. He stopped, moved left 3 feet. The vibration shifted, moved right, back past his starting point. The vibration shifted again. He found the axis, the north wall. He moved the lantern along the surface slowly, examining the stonework. The fitted fieldstone looked identical to every other wall in the basement. The same material, the same jointing, the same age. But when he held the key close to a specific section, approximately 4 feet from the floor and 2 feet from the left corner, the vibration in the metal became a sensation he could feel in his wrist and forearm, a frequency that was unmistakable because it was unlike anything else. He examined the wall at that point closely, bringing the lantern inches from the surface. There was a crack, or what appeared to be a crack, the kind of natural fracture that occurs in old stone construction over decades of settling and thermal cycling. But when he traced it with his finger, moving along its length, the crack made a shape. A rectangle, 4 inches wide and 2 inches tall, the edges too regular, too consistent in their width, too exact in their corners, to be anything but deliberate. A slot. He fit the triangular key into the slot. It went in smoothly, the fit machined to a tolerance that had survived a century without degradation. He turned it clockwise as the symbol on the key's face indicated. The sound that came from within the wall was extraordinary. The measured engagement of gears, the precise sequential engagement of a mechanism designed for reliability over speed, each gear finding its mate and transferring its load in the order the designer had specified. The sound of something that had been waiting for this moment for 95 years and was now, without drama, doing exactly what it had been built to do. The stone moved, not quickly. Augustus Wren had not built things that moved quickly, but with a slow, certain massive authority, a section of the wall swung inward on a concealed central pivot, revealing a passage behind it. Nora exhaled beside him, a long, slow breath. Declan said nothing. He was staring at the opening. In the lantern light, his face showed an expression Elliot had not seen on it before. Not the controlled assessment, that was his default, but something less guarded, something that, in a younger child, would have been wonder. Elliot held the lantern up and looked into the passage. Narrow, stone-walled, the ceiling close, sloping slightly downward over its length. He stepped inside. The passage was 50 feet long. He counted his steps. The walls were lined with the same careful stonework as the basement, but these stones bore carved symbols, not the dense composition of the pantry wall, but individual symbols placed at regular intervals. The visual language of the preservation system, marking the path the way trailblazers mark a route through a forest. He followed them. At the far end, the passage opened into a circular chamber. Elliot's lantern light swept across the space and he stopped walking. Steel filing cabinets lined the curved walls, 4 drawers each, their surfaces dusty but intact, the metal showing only the surface oxidation of long exposure to damp air, rather than the deep corrosion that would have indicated moisture penetration. Augustus had done something to the stone or the mortar that had kept the chamber drier than the surrounding basement, some treatment applied to the walls that had held for nearly a century. Wooden crates were stacked in one section, sealed with wax at the joins, the wax still intact. Glass-fronted display cases stood against one wall, their surfaces filmed with fine white mineral dust. And through the glass of the cases, catching the lantern light, Elliot could see documents. He moved closer. He pressed his face close to the glass. Stock certificates, dozens of them, arranged in orderly rows, each in its own sleeve of protective covering. The names on them were names he recognized, companies that had been founded in the railroad and industrial age of the late 19th century and had survived everything that followed. The Depression, the World Wars, the post-war expansion, the booms and contractions of the following decades. Companies that had become, over the intervening century, among the most valuable institutions in the American economy. And beside the stock certificates, bond documents, government issues from the 1920s, carrying face values that would have compounded across 9 decades of accumulated interest into figures Elliot could not calculate accurately in his head, in a stone room, in lantern light. He turned around. Declan was standing just inside the chamber entrance, his notebook open in his hands, not writing anything, just holding it. The calculation that was normally in his face was gone. Something else had replaced it. The specific expression of a 16-year-old encountering something that exceeds the categories his experience has given him. Nora was beside her brother. She had her sketchbook, but she was not drawing. She was looking at the room the way she looked at things she was trying to hold exactly in her memory, because she understood, with the instinct of an artist, that some moments are not improved by the act of recording them. Some moments you hold directly, in the unmediated way, and let the recording come later. "Dad," Declan said, his voice had changed. "How much is this?" Elliot looked at the display cases, at the filing cabinets he had not yet opened, at the crates whose contents he could not yet see, at the walls that held whatever the deeper chambers contained. "A great deal," he said, "more than I can estimate right now." He heard footsteps, not from the passage behind them, from somewhere in the basement, a different direction, another entrance, somewhere in the chamber wall that he had not yet examined. The footsteps were deliberate and unhurried, the footsteps of someone who knew the general layout even if they did not know every step of the path. Fletcher Wren stepped into the chamber. He looked different in this light. In the driveway 2 weeks ago, in his tailored suit with the Vermont autumn behind him, Fletcher Wren had looked like a man who controlled the terms of any situation he entered. Here in the stone chamber, in the lantern light, in the close air that had been sealed for nearly a century, he looked like something else. He still wore the suit. His posture was still straight. But his face, the careful, calibrated face of a man practiced in presenting the version of himself most useful to his purposes, had come undone slightly at the edges. The control was still there, but the thing it was controlling was visible now in a way it had not been before. He stood at the chamber entrance and looked at the display cases. For a moment, just a moment, he looked at them the way a man looks at something he has spent too long wanting, the specific quality of longing that has curdled slightly, over too many years of going unsatisfied, into something harsher. Then he looked at Elliot. "Quite a discovery," he said. His voice was steady. That was the thing about Fletcher Wren. Whatever happened inside him stayed inside him, and what came out was always measured. "You've been here before," Elliot said. "Not a question." "4 times," Fletcher said. "Over 15 years." He paused and something moved across his face. Not quite regret, more like the acknowledgement of a specific failure. "The last time was 14 months ago. I found the pantry wall, found the key fragments in the pantry and the library." He stopped. "But the bedroom. I couldn't find the third piece. I lost my patience." Elliot thought of the headboard, the marks around the carved panel that he had noticed on his first thorough examination of the master bedroom, marks that he had initially attributed to old damage, some previous occupants' rough handling of the furniture. The specific pattern of the scarring. Not random, not the damage of careless movement, but the marks of a tool applied to a specific area with repeated force. A chisel or a pry bar, used in anger, or in frustration, or in the particular desperation of a man who had been looking for something for a very long time and had come close enough to feel it and still could not reach it. "You were trying to force it," Elliot said. Fletcher nodded once, precise without apology. "A family characteristic, apparently." He walked further into the chamber, his eyes moving across the filing cabinets and the crates and the display cases with the evaluative attention of a man who had been imagining this room for a very long time and was now reconciling the imagination with the reality. "My grandfather spent 20 years on this," he said. "My father spent 15 more after him. I've spent 15 of my own, 3 generations, Mr. Marsh, looking for something that was built by the man our family came from. Augustus's sister was my great-great-grandmother. His sister's line is our line." He turned and looked at Elliot. "This was supposed to be ours." Elliot held the completed key loosely in his right hand. He said, "How many times did your grandfather come here?" Fletcher considered. "Twice. He could not find the pantry wall. He didn't know what he was looking for." "And your father?" "3 times. He found the wall. Could not read the symbols." "And you found the wall, found 2 of the 3 keys, and still couldn't open the chamber?" "Not in 15 years." Fletcher did not answer. "Augustus knew your family would come," Elliot said. "He built a system that required something specific, and in 3 generations, your family couldn't provide it." "You're a substitute teacher," Fletcher said. The words were not meant as an insult, more as a statement of category, the way an engineer states a variable. Elliot had years of practice not receiving such statements as insults. 26 days, Elliot said. He had been counting. Fletcher looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the quality of a man accustomed to carrying weight alone, a man for whom sitting down was not weakness but the honest acknowledgement of what a long time of carrying does, he sat down on one of the wooden crates. "My father told me," he said, his voice quieter now, "that this was our birthright. He said it the way men say things they need to believe to keep moving forward. And I believed him. I organized 30 years of my life around recovering something a dead man decided my family didn't deserve." He paused. "Do you have any idea what that costs a person?" Elliot looked at him. He thought of 24 years of substitute teaching, of the mornings when the call did not come, when you were not needed, when the school had found someone else or the regular teacher had recovered or the day had simply not required you. Of a marriage that had dissolved not in catastrophe, but in the long, quiet withdrawal of 2 people who had wanted different things and taken too long to acknowledge it. Of his father's silence, reliable as weather, the silence that communicated more by its constancy than any words would have. Of the conference room in Burlington 3 weeks ago, and the sound of polite amusement at a volume calculated to carry. "Yes," he said, "I have some idea." Fletcher looked at him, and something shifted in his expression. Not friendship, it was too early for that, and perhaps too late. Not trust, but a kind of recognition. The specific recognition of 2 people who have, by different paths, arrived at a similar understanding of what certain kinds of costs feel like. $5 million, Fletcher said, "for your claim to the property and everything in it. No litigation, no delays, clean." Elliot was quiet for a moment, not considering the offer. He had already considered it, in the way that he had considered and declined every previous offer. He was quiet because what he was about to say mattered, and he wanted to say it correctly. "I've been reading his journal," Elliot said. "Augustus, he writes about the failure of institutions, the failure of systems. He writes about the difference between wealth that is inherited and character that is earned. He looked around the chamber at the walls that had held this for nearly a century. He didn't build this to protect his money from the market. He built it because he'd already decided that money given to the wrong person becomes a weapon. He built a filter. And your family, I thought, he stopped. Then, I'm sorry, I genuinely am, but I'm not selling. Fletcher stood. The controlled expression was fully reinstated. He straightened the jacket, a gesture so practiced it was almost unconscious. Then we'll settle it in court. He left the way he had come, through the second passage, his footsteps measured and unhurried. The sound of them faded into the stone. But before the SUV reached the gate, it stopped. Elliot had followed his children back through the passage and up the basement stairs and was standing on the porch when he saw it stop. Fletcher got out alone and walked back toward the house. He did not come all the way to the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and stood there for a moment without coming closer, looking up at the manor the way a man looks at something that has defeated him repeatedly and that he has not entirely made his peace with. Then he looked at Elliot. There are others like this one, he said. Properties, hidden systems, men from the same period who built the same kind of thing for the same reasons. He paused. I've known about them for years. My research turned them up alongside everything I found about this house. I never had a reason to share that information. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Now I do. He turned and walked back to the Escalade, and this time it drove away and did not stop. The legal papers arrived 2 days later. Fletcher Wren, acting through a Boston firm with offices in 4 states, had filed a claim with the Vermont Probate Court contesting the ownership of Wren Manor and its contents. The filing was thorough. It alleged that Harold Marsh had acquired the property through a transaction in 1962 that had not fully resolved competing claims dating to the Wren family's departure in 1929, and that the intervening decades of apparent clear ownership did not extinguish those claims, given that the primary assets in dispute, the preservation system's contents, had remained sealed and inaccessible throughout the period. The filing requested a temporary hold on any removal or transfer of property pending resolution and cited 3 precedents from Vermont probate law that, Elliot read twice to be sure he understood correctly, might actually support the argument. He read the filing at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, with the journal open beside it and the photographs of the carved walls arranged around him in the order he had come to understand them. The lantern threw warm light across the kitchen. The manor was quiet. He was not panicked. He could not afford panic. It used resources he needed for other things. He called Mrs. Doyle at the library the following morning, before her shift started, because he had learned that she arrived 30 minutes early and used that time for her own reading. He asked her specifically, was there anything in the county historical archives, any document that might have been filed or registered in Aldenmore or the surrounding county at any point by any party that pertained to the legal disposition of the Wren estate or its contents? She called him back 4 hours later. There was. In the county records archive, stored in the basement of the county administration building, misfiled in a box of routine property surveys from the same period and therefore overlooked during every previous search, was a document dated September 1929, notarized and witnessed by 3 parties, bearing Augustus Wren's signature in the ball-precise hand that Elliot now recognized immediately. Doyle had asked the county archivist to pull the original box, and she had read the document herself before calling. She read Elliot the key clause over the phone, slowly, because she understood that the words needed to land correctly. The trust stated that the entirety of Augustus Wren's preserved assets, defined specifically as all holdings deposited within the preservation system, constructed within Wren Manor, would be conveyed in full to the individual who completed the full challenge of the preservation system, regardless of familial relationship, subject to one condition, that the completion be achieved honestly, and that the individual demonstrate in their own words and in the presence of at least one witness what they intended to build with what they had found. Regardless of familial relationship, Elliot sat with this for a long time after he put the phone down. The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window above the sink, he could see the oak trees at the edge of the property, their branches bare now, the leaves having come down in the week of rain that had followed the first hard frost. The trust had been filed simultaneously in 3 jurisdictions, Burlington, Boston, and Hartford, in September of 1929, filed 1 month before the family's disappearance. Filed with the specific intention of being found by the county archives and being available to anyone who looked, while remaining misfiled long enough that only someone genuinely searching with the patience to work through boxes of routine surveys, not just the indexed records, would find it. He read the trust clause again in his notes, what they intended to build with what they had found. He turned that sentence over in his mind for a long time. He did not have 48 hours to circle around this. He had 48 hours to stop circling entirely and start telling the truth about something he had been working toward for 52 years without ever having the occasion or the necessity to name it directly. He got up from the kitchen table and went to find his children. The manor was quieter at night than any place Elliot had ever slept. Not the quiet of absence, not the flat, characterless silence of his apartment in town, where the quiet was simply the absence of traffic and neighbors and the ordinary friction of a life lived in proximity to other lives. This was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of a place that had been holding something for a very long time and knew it and had learned patience from the holding. The quiet of a structure that had been built to last and had lasted and was still here, still standing, still waiting for what it had been built to wait for. He sat at the kitchen table with the lantern turned low and the documents spread around him. The journal, the architectural drawing from the master bedroom, now annotated in his own handwriting with the conclusions he had reached about the four-chamber system. The photographs of the carved walls, arranged in the order he had come to understand them. The trust agreement, transcribed in his own notes from Mrs. Doyle's reading over the phone. Nora and Declan were asleep upstairs. He had put them to bed at 10. Nora had barely made it through dinner before her eyes started losing their focus, the particular dimming of a child who has been running hard on adrenaline and curiosity for days and has finally reached the edge of what the body will sustain. Declan had lasted another hour before he stopped pretending to read and fell asleep with his notebook still open on his chest, the pen still loosely in his fingers. Elliot had taken the notebook from his son's hands carefully, the way you take something from a person sleeping, holding it so the pen did not fall and make a sound on the floor, and set them both on the floor beside the bed. Then he had come back downstairs and sat down with what he knew and what he did not know. The architectural drawing showed 3 more chambers below the one they had found. Not beside it, below it. The system was vertical. The first chamber was a landing, an antechamber, as the drawing labeled it, an introduction. The place where the system tested whether you had gotten this far and established that you were present, that you had the key, that you had followed the path. What lay beneath it was the substance of what Augustus Wren had spent the last year of his time in Aldenmore constructing and filling. And the entrance to what lay beneath was not keyed, not mechanical, not a puzzle of symbols or fragments or magnetic resonance. It was a question. Carved into the stone floor of the antechamber, directly beneath the point where a person would stand after entering from the passage, positioned so that you would look down and see it the moment you stopped, were the words he had read in the trust agreement. What will you build with this that will outlast you by 100 years? Below the question, cut into the stone with the same precision as every other element of the preservation system, a rectangular space, shallow like a tray, approximately the size of a piece of writing paper. Empty. Waiting. Elliot had stood over that space the evening after Fletcher left, when he had brought the children back down to see the antechamber properly. He had read the question in the stone. He had understood immediately what it was asking in the general sense. The specific sense, what it was asking from him, what answer it required from his particular life and his particular 52 years, was what he had spent the evening and most of the night working out. Now, past midnight, with the house breathing quietly around him and the lantern throwing a small circle of warmth across the kitchen table, he understood. The question was not asking for a plan. Plans were easy. Plans were the language of people who wanted to appear serious without committing to anything specific. He had sat through enough school board meetings, enough community hearings, enough parent-teacher conferences that had been called to address problems but had produced only plans, to know that a well-formatted plan was often the most efficient, available method of saying nothing at all while sounding thorough. Plans protected the planner. Plans could be revised. Plans had exits built into them. The question was asking for something that cost something to give. Not money. Money was easy. Money was just the arithmetic of exchange. Something from the interior, from the actual truth of what he was, what he had done, what he intended to do with what remained of his time. He opened his notebook to a clean page. He uncapped his pen. He sat there for a long time before he wrote the first word. Not because he did not know what to say. The words were there, had always been there, had simply never been asked for in quite this direct a way. But because he wanted to be sure before he wrote them that they were the true words rather than the polished for presentation version of the true words. That distinction mattered here in a way it had not always mattered. He began to write. At 4:17 in the morning, his phone buzzed on the table beside him. Bernard Marsh. Calling at 4:17 in the morning. Elliot picked up on the second ring. His father's voice came through the speaker the way old wood sounds when you tap it, solid with a slight resonance that communicates density and time. The voice of a man who had been a certain way for a long time and was not going to change, which was a limitation and also a kind of reliability. "You're still up," Bernard said. It was not a question. His father had always been able to tell, from the quality of Elliot's voice in the first syllable of the first word, exactly what kind of night he was having. This was not insight exactly, more like the accumulated calibration of decades of attention. The way a man who has watched weather long enough can read it from the sky before the instruments confirm it. "Yeah," Elliot said, a pause. The kind of pause his father used in place of the transitional phrases other people used. Not silence as avoidance, but silence as selection. The pause of a man who was choosing carefully among the available words. "I drove up to Aldenmore yesterday," Bernard said. "In the afternoon, I didn't stop. Just drove past the place. Looked at it from the road." Elliot said nothing. "It's a significant house," his father said. The word significant, Bernard Marsh's highest available acknowledgement. The word he used for the things that had, by their scale or their permanence or their quality, earned it. He did not use the word often. Another pause. "Your mother," Bernard said, "always told me you were the one who wouldn't quit. She said it was the finest thing she could say about a person." A brief silence in which Elliot could hear his father breathing, the sound of an old man in the dark holding something he should have said a long time ago and was saying now because the alternative, continuing to not say it, had become the worse option. "I should have said that myself a long time ago." The line went quiet. Then his father said goodnight, and the call ended. Elliot sat with the phone in his hand for a long moment. He looked at what he had been writing. The page was nearly full. He had been at it for 4 hours, and he was almost done. He put the phone down, uncapped his pen, and wrote the last paragraph. He read it back twice. Not to polish it, he had done enough of that, and every revision that was improving the prose was also, he noticed, making it slightly less true. He read it to make sure the words on the page were the actual words, not the presentable version of the actual words. That the context he had provided was honest context and not strategic context. That what he said he intended to do was what he actually intended to do, not what sounded best. Satisfied, not with the quality of the writing, which was adequate, but with its honesty, he capped his pen. He looked at the clock. 4:43 in the morning. Gray light beginning in the window above the sink, the particular gray of October pre-dawn in Vermont, the color of something undecided, the sky not yet willing to commit to the day. He got up, put the kettle on, and waited for his children to wake up. Declan came down first, drawn by the smell of coffee, at 6:15. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at his father, at the documents on the table, the open notebook, the particular quality of stillness in a person who has been up all night and has, by the time the morning comes, arrived somewhere. He did not ask how it had gone. He looked at his father's face and read what the face showed, and the face showed that it had gone the way it needed to go. "You found it," Declan said. "I wrote it," Elliot said. "That's the same thing in this case." Declan sat down across from him. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Elliot had made. Black, the way he had started drinking it this past year. The quiet, independent decision of a 16-year-old who has decided to present himself to the world as older than his years demand, and sat with both hands around the cup. "What happens now?" he asked. "We go back down," Elliot said, "all three of us." Nora appeared at his kitchen door 20 minutes later, her braid loose from sleep, still in the oversized flannel shirt that served as her pajama top in this house where the heating was inconsistent. She looked at her father and her brother sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning light, the documents between them, the notebook open, the 2 cups of coffee. She looked at her father's face specifically. She did not say good morning. She said, "Is it time?" "Almost," Elliot said. "Sit down and eat something first." She sat. She ate a bowl of oatmeal with the focused efficiency of a person who understands that the body has requirements that do not pause for significance. She did not open her sketchbook, which told Elliot something about how she understood the weight of the morning. Some mornings were for drawing. This one was for doing. At 7 o'clock, the three of them went downstairs. The passage through the basement wall was the same as the previous days. Narrow, stone-walled, sloping gently down, the lantern throwing their shadows long and wavering ahead of them on the passage walls. But the antechamber felt different in the morning. Not larger, not more or less impressive than it had been in the evenings when they had examined it. Just different in the way that familiar places feel different when you arrive at them with a different purpose. The same room inhabited differently. Elliot led them to the center of the chamber floor, to the question carved in the stone. Nora crouched down and read it aloud in a low voice, as though the words deserved to be spoken rather than merely seen, as though speaking them was a form of respect for the man who had carved them here and waited for nearly a century for someone to stand above them. Elliot crouched down beside his daughter. He tore the page from his notebook carefully along the perforation so that it came away clean. He looked at it one more time in the lantern light. He had written, 24 years of substitute teaching, showing up in other people's classrooms, doing the work that nobody else wanted to do that day, going home when the day was done. 2 children raised mostly alone after a marriage that ended quietly, without catastrophe, just the long and patient withdrawal of 2 people who had wanted different things and taken too long to say so. Never owning anything of significance, never being the person in the room whose decisions were the ones that mattered. Being the person people called when the right person wasn't available, and doing that work as well as it could be done, because the children in those borrowed classrooms deserved that regardless of who their teacher was that day. He had written all of that, not as complaint or self-pity, as context, the ground he was standing on, the ground from which whatever came next would grow. And then he had written what he intended to do, restore the manor. Not as a private residence, and not as a trophy demonstrating that the outcome had been reversed. The mockery answered. That was not why, and he wanted to be honest about that even in a document no one else would read, as a working institution. A museum of local history and industrial heritage, centered on the story of Augustus Wren and the era he had built in. A story that was also the story of Aldenmore, and every small New England town that had been shaped by the decisions of men who built things and left things behind. A scholarship program for students from Aldenmore and the surrounding towns, funded from the trust, focused on engineering and the trades, on the knowledge that produced people who could build things that lasted and repair things that were breaking. A library, a real library with a real archivist, with real hours, accessible to anyone who needed it, the way libraries were supposed to be. And the last paragraph, which had taken him from midnight to 4:43 in the morning to write, not because he did not know what to say, but because he needed to say it without the protective coating of presentation. I do not know if this is the right answer. I only know it is the true one. I have spent my working life teaching other people's children in other people's classrooms. And the single thing I know with certainty, the thing that 24 years of that work has burned into me at a level below argument, is that the only wealth that multiplies is the kind you give away. I will build something that teaches, because teaching is the only thing I have ever known how to do, and I have been doing it in borrowed rooms for long enough. He placed the page as the rectangular space in the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. The lantern burned steadily. The stone was cold under his knees. Somewhere above them, the manor shifted slightly in the morning wind, the small settling sound of a large structure adjusting to the day. Then the sound began. It was deep, below the range of what he had expected from a mechanical system, a subsonic resonance that arrived in his chest before his ears registered it as sound. The vibration of something very large that had been very precisely balanced beginning to move for the first time in 95 years. The floor of the antechamber shivered under by her feet, not violently but steadily, communicating mass and intention through the soles of their shoes and up through their bodies. In the wall to the left, a seam appeared, a vertical line perfectly straight that had not been visible a moment before. The seam widened as the section of wall it bordered began to move, pivoting on a central mechanism concealed within the stone itself, swinging outward with a steadiness that communicated the quality of its construction, not just in the lack of shudder or catch, but in the silence. Only the deep resonance of the mechanism driving it. No grinding, no protest. An entire section of the wall, 10 feet wide, 8 feet tall, opened. The air that came through was cold and dry and utterly still. The air of a sealed space undisturbed for nearly a century. It smelled of stone and old metal and the faint mineral quality of the particular soil under Aldenmore, Vermont. Beyond the opening, a staircase, cut into the living rock, descending. Nora took her father's hand. He squeezed it once and then led them down. The master vault was circular, like the antechamber above it, but larger, 30 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that rose to a vaulted point 12 feet overhead. The walls were lined with steel panels, each one engraved with the continuous geometric design that ran unbroken around the entire circumference of the room. The same visual language as every carved surface in the manor, but here resolved into its complete and final form, the full statement of which all the individual puzzles above had been preliminary expressions. Here it was complete. Here you could see what the fragments were fragments of. The lantern light moved across it all, slowly as Elliot turned. The filing cabinets built into the lower sections of the walls, the flat drawers above them that held documents in protective sleeves, the wooden shelving units on one side bearing sealed containers labeled in Augustus Wren's handwriting, the glass-fronted cases displaying certificates and documents that caught the light and held it. In the center of the room, on a stone pedestal that had been built as an integral part of the vault's floor, not placed on the floor but grown from it, part of the same construction, stood a single wooden box, medium-sized, dark with a century of aging. The initials A inlaid in lighter wood on the lid, the inlay still precise, the contrast still clear. Elliot crossed the room to it. He lifted the lid. Inside, a letter sealed with wax, the seal stamped with a compass rose, the same symbol as the key's bow. And beneath the letter, another document, folded in thick and official in the way that legal documents from that era were official, bearing the weight of formality that had been intended to outlast the person who created it. He broke the seal and read the letter aloud. Augustus Wren had written it in September of 1929, in the weeks before his family left Aldenmore. The handwriting was the same as the journal, small, precise, but the register was entirely different. This was not a record of observations or a log of preparations. This was a man speaking directly, across the distance of whatever time had passed, to whoever was standing in this room. If you are reading this, you have done something that my own family, across 3 generations and whatever time has passed, could not. You have answered honestly. That is rarer than you may know, and rarer than the people who cannot do it will ever understand. What you have found here is not merely wealth. Wealth is common. It is created and destroyed in every generation. It follows cycles as regular as weather. It is always somewhere and never permanently anywhere. What you have found is the product of careful thought applied over a long time to the question of what endures. The investments in these walls were chosen not for their immediate return, but for their capacity to grow through whatever came next. Much has come next. They have grown accordingly. I ask one thing of you, not as a condition of ownership. The trust has already conveyed that, and I designed the trust to be incontestable by anyone who might wish to contest it. I ask it as a request from one person to another across the distance of time. Use what I have built here to build something that will still be standing and still be useful when your grandchildren are the age you are now. That is the only test that has ever mattered. Everything else is arithmetic. The second document in this box is the trust agreement in its complete form, including the activation clause triggered by your completion of the full system. The trustees I named have been replaced across the years by successor firms with standing instructions. They have been waiting. You will not face what comes next alone. Build well. A.W. September 14th, 1929, Elliot folded the letter. He stood in the stone room with his two children beside him. The lantern light moved slowly across the engraved walls, the geometric patterns shifting as the flame breathed, giving the room the quality of something alive and attentive. He held the letter in both hands and did not say anything for a long time. Then Declan said quietly, "What's in the filing cabinets?" Elliot almost laughed. It was so exactly the right question, asked in so exactly the right tone. Not awed, not overwhelmed, just the practical next step stated as a question by a 16-year-old who had learned to lead with pragmatism as his way of managing the scale of what he felt. "Let's find out," Elliot said. They were still in the vault when the sound came from above. Footsteps. Multiple sets, not a tempting quiet, moving through the manor's ground floor, with the irregular searching pattern of people who know roughly where they are going but not exactly. Voices, at least 3, maybe 4. And underneath the voices, another sound, the particular acoustic signature of a television camera being carried, the slight mechanical hum of equipment under power. Elliot recognized one of the voices. He led Nora and Declan back through the new staircase, through the antechamber, along the passage, up the basement steps. When they came through the basement door into the kitchen, the manor's ground floor was occupied. Fletcher Wren stood in the kitchen doorway. Behind him were 2 men in suits, attorneys by the look of them, the particular grooming and posture of men who spent their professional lives in courtrooms and conference rooms. Beside one of them was a younger man carrying a video camera on a shoulder rig, the red recording light active. Through the front windows, Elliot could see 2 additional vehicles in the driveway. A woman he did not recognize stood near the gate, speaking on a phone, her breath making small clouds in the cold morning air. A local news team. Fletcher had made the call. Fletcher's face was composed and purposeful. The face Elliot had seen in the driveway 6 weeks ago. The face of a man arriving to establish the terms of a situation. He looked at Elliot and the 2 children coming up from the basement, and something moved behind his eyes. Something brief and complicated. A recognition of what the emergence from the basement meant, before the composure settled back into place. "Mr. Marsh," he said. The tone was for the camera as much as for Elliot. Not hostile, but formal. The tone of a man placing himself on record. "I think we need to have a direct conversation about the status of this property and what has occurred here this morning." "We can do that," Elliot said. He set the lantern down on the kitchen counter. He took the 2 documents from under his arm, Augustus's letter and the trust agreement, and placed them on the kitchen table. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, with the same unhurried deliberateness he used when he walked into an unfamiliar classroom and needed to establish, without aggression or performance, whose room it was. He had been practicing that move for 24 years. "The complete trust agreement," Elliot said, "was filed by Augustus Wren in September of 1929 with 3 law firms in 3 separate jurisdictions, Burlington, Boston, and Hartford. I have the original here, recovered from the county archives in Aldenmore. The trust was activated this morning when I completed the full system as Augustus designed it, all 4 chambers, including the master vault." He looked at Fletcher directly. "The activation clause supersedes all probate claims filed after the trust's execution. Your filing was made last week. The trust was filed 95 years ago." Fletcher looked at the documents on the table. One of his attorneys, the older one with silver-framed glasses and the expression of a man who had seen a great many surprises in his professional life, leaned forward and examined the trust agreement carefully without touching it. He straightened up and said something quietly to Fletcher. Fletcher's composure held, but it held differently now. The way a structure holds when the load it was designed for has been met and slightly exceeded, still standing. But the relationship between the load and the structure had changed. "The trust may be valid," Fletcher said. His voice was careful now in a different way than it had been careful before. "Not managed, considered. But there will be questions about chain of custody, condition of the original documents. Vermont Probate will have the originals by end of day," Elliot said, "along with the county archive records confirming where and when the document was filed, and the documentation of the successor trustee firms who have maintained the standing instructions across the intervening decades." He paused. Augustus named successors. He thought about this the way he thought about everything else. He anticipated the challenges and he built the solutions in advance. The kitchen was very quiet. The cameraman had set the equipment down, the lens pointing at the floor, which was its own kind of statement about how the scene was reading. Fletcher Wren stood in the kitchen doorway of the house his ancestor had built, and he looked at the documents on the table, and then he looked at Elliot Marsh, a 52-year-old substitute teacher in an 11-year-old jacket, sitting at the head of the table with his daughter and son on either side of him, and he was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The precision was still there, but the purpose behind it was different. He was no longer managing a negotiation or establishing a position. He was, for possibly the first time since Elliot had met him, simply talking. He really did know, Fletcher said, about my family, about what we would become. He knew what the pressure of wanting something for too long does to people, Elliot said. He'd seen it in business. Men who had wanted particular outcomes so badly and for so long that the wanting had reshaped them. He didn't want to give his legacy to someone who had been made harder and narrower by the pursuit of it. Fletcher looked at the wall. The carved wall of the pantry was visible through the doorway, the composition of symbols, the word at the center. He looked at it for a moment, and he thought you were different. I wasn't looking for it, Elliot said. I think that was the point. The attorneys exchanged a look. The woman outside had stopped talking on the phone and was watching through the window. The whole manor was very quiet. Fletcher straightened his jacket, the gesture of a man restoring his own bearing from the outside in, the small ritual of self-collection. He said, "My attorneys will review the trust documents. I won't obstruct the process." He paused at the doorway. For whatever it may be worth to you, you answered the question correctly. I've spent 30 years thinking about what I would have said if I had been standing where you were standing this morning. I don't think I would have written what you wrote. He left. His team followed. The news van sat in the driveway for several minutes, idling, and then it too departed. And the manor was quiet again, and Elliot sat at the kitchen table with his children beside him. And the October morning came fully through the windows, clear and cold and without compromise. And the brass key sat on the table between them where he had set it, catching the light. The calls came in the order he expected. Warren called first that afternoon. The call was brief and direct, in the email drafting voice Warren used when he wanted to be clear without being elaborate. I heard. I was wrong about this property. I won't make that mistake again. No apology beyond the acknowledgement. Warren did not do elaborate apologies. He corrected the record and moved forward. It was enough. Claudia called an hour later. She had already begun thinking about next steps. She knew several architects in Burlington who specialized in historical restoration. She had worked with two of them on commercial projects and could vouch for their quality. She could make introductions whenever Elliot was ready. Elliot thanked her and meant it. The offer was genuinely useful, and Claudia's way of acknowledging that she had been wrong was to immediately become useful in the direction of the right answer. He had known that about her for 40 years. It was not nothing. Sylvia called that evening after the children were back with her. Her voice had a different quality than it had had in their post-divorce communications. Quieter, more personal, stripped of the careful, measured register they had both developed over 6 years of co-parenting at a cautious distance. She said, "Nora told me what you wrote, what you said about teaching." A pause in which Elliot could hear her choosing her words with more than usual care. "I didn't understand that about you. For a long time. I think I do now." She did not apologize in so many words. She did not need to. Elliot understood what the sentence had cost her to say, and he accepted it for what it was. His father, he called himself, the following morning. Bernard answered on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting the call. Elliot told him what had happened, briefly, factually, in the way that the two of them had always communicated best, without the ornament that obscured as much as it illuminated. Bernard listened without interrupting. When Elliot finished, his father was quiet for a moment. Then Bernard said, "I'd like to come see it, if that would be agreeable to you." Elliot said it was. Bernard arrived on a Saturday, driving himself the 2 hours from Burlington in the reliable way of a man who had not stopped doing the things he had always done simply because he was 78. He pulled up to the gate and got out of the car before Elliot came down the driveway to meet him, and he stood at the gate in the same spot Elliot had stood 6 weeks earlier, on the morning this had all begun. He stood there for a moment without speaking, looking up at the manor. Not at the restoration work already underway, the new porch supports, the cleared windows, the vines beginning to come down from the turrets. At the house itself, the structure, the scale of what had been built here and what had been preserved here and what, apparently, was going to be built here again. Then he pushed the gate open himself and walked up the driveway. They walked the grounds together without speaking much. Bernard moved through the rooms with the attention of a man who had built things in his life. Physical things, structures that had to bear load and resist weather and serve the purposes they were designed for, and who had not lost the ability to read what a structure represented in terms of the thought and work that had gone into it. He ran his hand along the mahogany banister. He stood in the doorway of the library and looked at the shelves for a long moment. He went down to the basement, and Elliot opened the passage, and Bernard stood in the antechamber for a long time, looking at the carved floor and the now open wall and the staircase descending, and said nothing. When they came back up and were standing on the restored wraparound porch in the late afternoon light, the Vermont afternoon of early November, clear and cold, the sky the particular shade of blue that only exists in the weeks after leaf fall, when there is nothing between the sky and the eye, Bernard said, "It's a significant house," which, from Bernard Marsh, was everything. They stood together looking out at the grounds, the overgrown gardens that would need attention, the oak trees that had been old when Augustus Wren planted them, the iron gate at the end of the driveway that needed repainting, the town of Aldenmore, visible in the valley below, the white steeple of the Congregational Church catching the late sun. "I should have told you," Bernard said, "a long time ago, what your mother said, about you being the one who wouldn't quit." Elliot looked at his father's profile. The white hair, the upright posture maintained by decades of habit, the face of a man who had spent a long time finding it difficult to say the things that needed saying, and had arrived, at 78, at the understanding that the difficulty was not a reason to continue not saying them. "You told me at 4:17 in the morning," Elliot said. "I was exactly where I needed to hear it." Bernard was quiet, then very slightly he nodded. It was the nod of a man accepting something. Not agreeing with a proposition, but accepting a conclusion, closing a long account. They stood on the porch until the sun went behind the hills and the cold came in earnest. And then they went inside and Elliot made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the photographs had been spread, where the documents had been read, where the notebook had been filled in the small hours of a morning that now seemed both very recent and very long ago. And they talked for 2 hours. It was the longest conversation Elliot could remember having with his father. It was not revelatory, not emotional in any dramatic way. It was simply two men talking, with the patience and the honesty that had been difficult for too long and were now improbably available. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in April, the Wren Foundation for Education and Historical Preservation held its public opening. The manor had been restored through the winter by a team of craftsmen who had worked from Augustus Wren's original architectural drawings, the complete drawings, the full set retrieved from the master vault and supplemented by the county building records Mrs. Doyle had located and organized. The craftsmen had matched materials and methods to what had been there. The same species of wood for the replacement porch boards, the same mortar composition for the repointed stonework, the paint color verified against a fragment of the original found protected under the porch eave, a chip of colonial blue with white trim that had been sitting undisturbed since 1897. The result was not a museum piece, not the preserved corpse of a Victorian house maintained as an artifact of its era. It was a living building, restored to function, inhabited by the purpose it had been given. The paint was fresh, but not bright. The porch was solid, but not new-looking. The house looked like what it was, a structure that had been through a great deal and had been properly cared for and had emerged from the care stronger than it had been before. Inside, the foyer glowed. The chandelier had been cleaned, a 3-week process, crystal by crystal, and relit, and the prisms threw their colored light across the walls the way they had for the first decades of the house's life before the darkness. The library shelves held books again, a working collection, carefully curated, organized by a system that Mrs. Doyle had spent 6 weeks designing. The carved walls in the pantry and the library fireplace surround had been documented, professionally photographed, and lit with a precision installation that showed every line and symbol in sharp relief without damaging the original surface. Nora's contribution occupied one full wall of the library. She had spent 3 months on it, working at the manor on weekends and school breaks, coming back repeatedly to verify details, consulting the photographs in her own memory and the carved surfaces themselves. It was a large format drawing, rendered in her precise and quietly beautiful style. The complete map of Augustus Wren's preservation system, showing every carved wall, every symbol, every mechanical element, the key and the slot in the passage in the chambers, all of it assembled into a single composition that showed the entire puzzle as Augustus had designed it, from the first word on the pantry wall to the final question on the vault floor. The logic of it, the elegance of it, the way every element connected to every other element in a system that was complete and consistent and had been waiting for nearly a century to be understood. Visitors stood in front of it for long minutes, following the connections, tracing the path with their fingers without touching the surface, talking quietly to the people beside them. She was 12 years old. People kept forgetting that. Declan ran the technical demonstrations in the basement. The key, the slot, the mechanism, the passage, the antechamber, with the display cases now properly lit and the documents they contained cataloged by archivists from the State Historical Society, each one verified and valued and placed in the appropriate context. He had spent the winter learning the mechanics of Augustus Wren's system with the methodical depth of someone who had found a subject that matched his particular kind of mind, and he could explain it to groups of engineering students from the university in Burlington, who came on scheduled visits, requested in numbers that had exceeded the Foundation's capacity to accommodate them, and necessitated a waiting list, with a clarity and authority that made people forget they were being taught by a 17-year-old. He was applying to engineering programs in the fall. He had already decided what he wanted to study. The decision had been made in a stone basement in October, in the moment when a section of wall had swung inward and revealed what was behind it, and it had not wavered since. Elliot taught. He stood in the restored library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and taught local history to whoever came, adults mostly, retirees from Aldenmore and the surrounding towns, some parents with children old enough to pay attention, the occasional college student doing research for a project that had brought them to this corner of Vermont. He taught the way he had always taught, which was without performance and without the kind of projected enthusiasm that was really about the teacher rather than the subject. He taught because the subject was worth teaching. He taught because this room in this house was finally and completely his own, and the difference between teaching in a borrowed room and teaching in your own room was something he had not fully understood until he was standing in it. The scholarship program had awarded its first 8 grants in March. Students from Aldenmore and the 4 surrounding towns pursuing degrees in engineering, architecture, and the skilled trades, welding, electrical systems, structural construction, the disciplines that produced people who could build things that lasted and repair things that were failing. The selection committee had evaluated candidates based on a single criterion, articulated in the Foundation's charter in language that Elliot had written himself, and that read simply, demonstrated capacity for honest work in the face of discouragement. Augustus Wren, reading it across the distance of nearly a century, would have recognized the standard. He had used the same one. Mrs. Doyle had come out of partial retirement to serve as the Foundation's archivist. She had accepted the position when Elliot asked, without asking what it paid or what the hours would be or what the job title was, because she had looked at what needed to be done and understood that it was the correct use of what she knew. She did not consider it a favor to Elliot. She considered it a professional obligation to a collection of materials that deserved professional care. On the evening of the opening, after the last visitors had gone and the staff had locked the exterior doors and turned off most of the lights, Elliot walked through the manor alone. He moved through the foyer, the chandelier dark now, but the prism light still faintly present from the last of the daylight coming through the side windows. Through the dining room, the fieldstone fireplace now cleaned and functional, used for the first time in decades during the winter restoration work. Through the library, the books on the shelves, the reading chairs arranged, Nora's drawing on the wall receiving the last of the afternoon light through the tall east windows. He went to the pantry. He stood in front of the carved wall. The dedicated light fixture threw precise illumination across the surface, showing every line and symbol in sharp relief. The concentric rings, the astronomical notations, the mathematical sequences, the arrows and connective marks of a system designed to be read by the right person at the right time. And at the center, in the clear space that had always been clear, the word that had started all of it: begin. He stood there for a long time. He had stood in front of this wall hundreds of times in the past 6 months, during the restoration, during the installation of the lighting, during the documentation process, during the quiet moments at the end of working days when he came here before locking up. It never looked the same twice. The light changed it, and what he brought to the looking changed it, and both of those things were different every time. He thought about the man who had carved this, who had stood in this room in the summer and fall of 1929 and worked these symbols into the wood with tools he had selected for the precision they offered, in a house he was preparing to leave, building something he would never see completed and might never know had been found, trusting the future with the work of his hands and the intelligence of his design. Betting on the existence of a person he had no way of knowing. Elliot thought about that bet. Then in the quiet of the house, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, a text from Mrs. Doyle. "Something came to the office today that I held for you. I put it in the desk in the library. I thought you'd want to see it before Monday." He went to the library and sat at the desk. In the center drawer, where Mrs. Doyle had left it, was an envelope. No return address. Vermont postmark, date stamped 3 days earlier. His name and the foundation's address, written in a hand he did not recognize. Inside the envelope, a single sheet of paper. On it, a hand-drawn map. Not a casual sketch, but a careful, measured drawing. The kind made by someone who had looked at something with full attention and recorded it accurately. A building. 3 stories. Victorian. A property address in Brunswick, Maine on the coast. And in the lower right corner, in handwriting that had the quality of precision and economy he had come to associate with a particular kind of mind, 3 words: "Your turn now." No signature, nothing else. Elliot looked at the map for a long time. He thought about Fletcher Wren standing at the bottom of the porch steps in the October morning, after the confrontation, after the documents had been presented and the SUV had started to drive away and then stopped. The thing Fletcher had said before he got back in the car: "There are others like this one. I've known about them for years. I never had a reason to share that information. Now I do." He looked at the address in Brunswick, Maine. He thought about a man who had built a vault in 1929 and trusted the future with everything he had built, who had written "Build well" at the end of a letter he knew might not be read for decades, who had understood that the act of building was itself the statement, not what you said you would do, but what you actually did and what you built it to become. He put the map back in the envelope carefully. He put the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket. The Carhartt, 11 years old, the lining on the left sleeve still not repaired, because some things you keep exactly as they are. He stood up. He turned off the library light. He walked to the foot of the stairs. "Nora," he called. "Declan!" A pause, then footsteps on the floor above. 2 sets, both moving toward the landing. His daughter's voice came down the staircase with the particular quality it had when she already knew what she was about to be asked. "Is it time?" Elliot looked up at the landing. "Pack your bags," he said. "We're going to Maine."